Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I'm back from a week of vacation, and boy, there have been some things going on, including Texas, which has floating barriers on the Rio Grande River, and Joe Biden's Department of Justice wants that illegal alien invasion to continue, so they have demanded that Texas take those floating barriers away. And guess what? The governor of Texas informed the Biden administration today he will not comply. In other words, Joe Biden and your DOJ, pound sand. We're not taking the floating barriers off the Rio Grande River. We'll meet you in court. Abbott's refusal, as reported by thehill.com, comes just before the DOJ deadline for Abbott to comply with the federal government's request to remove the barriers. The DOJ threatened legal action against Texas if the barriers were not removed by Monday, today, at 2 p.m. Texas will see you in court, Mr. President. I think that is the perfect response. Glad to be with you on a Monday. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And our Twitter poll today, do remote workers, working from home or away from the usual office, do remote workers work even harder than those back in the office? Now, conventional wisdom would have it, you're sitting at home in your pajamas. Of course you're not working harder. Well, it turns out that when they did a study, workers who work from home end up working, on average, about a 10% increase in the work hours they put in. And a second study shows a 13% boost in productivity for home workers. They don't have to commute, and it ends up working out better for the boss and for the worker. So do remote workers work even harder? I would say yes. You can answer any way you like. You can find the question at Lars Larson Show, at larslarson.com as well. Always brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined, and you should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, I want to point something out to you. There's a song that is done by one of the top artists in country music. And I like the music. Jason Aldean did the song, and the song is called Try That in a Small Town. And it's a challenge. It says, don't bring the illegal acts that you commit in these big cities and get away with. Don't try that in a small town, or there's going to be trouble. You read through the lyrics, it's perfectly all-American. And yet Jason Aldean has come under fire from America's political left. They'd like to cancel him out. In fact, they already got Country Music Television, CMT, to pull down the video of that song. They say it's racist. They say it suggests lynching. It does no such thing, but it's been interesting to see how people have reacted to that. I'd be glad to get your calls, and let's start there. In Billings, Montana, Brian, welcome to the program. You've heard about Jason Aldean's song, and I assume you've heard the song like I have and have seen the video like I have. What's your take on that?
Well, thanks for having me on, Lars. I appreciate it. I've heard the song multiple times. First, I found no such thing of any racist lyrics or anything to that matter. Second of all, about 2 years ago, as you know, in Billings, Montana, it's the biggest city in Montana. But in comparison, it's about the same size as Gresham, Oregon.
Yeah.
So 2 years ago, there was word that Antifa and BLM were going to come and create havoc like they have in all the other big cities.
Yep.
Well, the police department here and all the legal citizens, they all came down armed, and we all gathered together, and there was a few of those members of those groups that actually came, but when they found out how big the group was here locally, they turned around and they just went the other direction. So I use that as a good example of what Jason Aldean's lyrics are in his song.
Yep.
That in a small town, we ain't going to have it here.
And I think there's nothing more all-American than that. To say, if you're going to try that in a small, you might get away with it in the anonymity of a big town. Try it in a small town, and people are going to say, you're not going to damage our town. You're not going to get away with that.
Absolutely.
And you show up in numbers, and I'll bet the folks in Billings never had to raise a fist, never had to point a gun. They simply showed up in numbers, and when Antifa and BLM showed up, they took one look at the crowd and said, okay, we're going somewhere else, right?
Absolutely, 100%. And it was just a matter of our presence being there. Legal, I mean, not legal, but, hardworking, tax-paying citizens.
Well, when you said legal, I assume you meant
armed.
law-abiding. Meaning, if law-abiding
That's what I meant.
citizens show up,
Yes.
we're not talking, about vigilantes. We're just saying you
No.
show up and you're going to do crimes, do them in front of us and see what happens, and we will call the cops.
Absolutely. And we had all law enforcement, sheriff's departments, and it was literally the PDs and law-abiding citizens, that were armed, that legally was able to, armed. That and the police departments fully supported us being there.
My impression of Antifa and BLM is ultimately they're cowards. So if they show up and they're in a big number and the people who are there who are law-abiding citizens are in small numbers, they know that they can intimidate that group. But when they show up and there's a group too big to intimidate, then all of a sudden they turn cowards and they run away. And I think that there's a lesson in that. If you show up, and I've seen prayer groups show up, small group, Antifa shows up in a big group, they intimidate the heck out of those people, and the people are forced to run to protect themselves and their families. That's not right. That's not America.
No.
You don't get to deny somebody else their right to gather in a public place simply because you have a big group and they have a small group. And you would think those on the left would actually agree with that.
Absolutely. 100%, Lars.
Absolutely. Brian, thanks very much. I appreciate the call. Let's get a naysayer in. Hey, Nathan, what do you and I disagree about today?
Hey, Lars. First-time caller, long-time listener. Agree with you most of the time.
Thank you.
But I can tell you the working at home thing, my wife and I own a company, and that didn't work out so well. We had to bring people back into the office. So I do not agree that people working at home get more work done.
Well, what happened? Did the people working at home just slack? Then you should fire them. You shouldn't even bring them back to the office. I mean, if somebody is capable of doing their job at a desk, but if they're trusted to go home, they don't get their job done. Is that what happened?
Well, the biggest problem is a lot of them have children, and then children end up at home, and it's hard for them to concentrate, and pretty soon you see a job lacking. So, and you never know whether they have their children there or not.
Well, that's a good point. Although I guess my concern would be if mom or dad works from home, they have to lay down the rules to the kids. Dad's working, mom's working. We will find something for you to do, a book for you to read, some chores for you to do, but we're not going to just let you stop mom and dad from working. I mean, moms and dads have been working from home literally for thousands of years in human culture. You'd think they could do it today, especially with all the help they can get elsewhere. Back in a moment. Glad to get your calls. It's a Monday, and you're listening to the Radio Northwest Network. A shout-out to WCHV in Charlottesville. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday. It's my pleasure to be with you. And if you want to jump into what we call the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. I want to put this question to our friend Tristan Justice from The Federalist. He's the Western correspondent for TheFederalist.com. The Democrats impeached Donald Trump twice. In fact, the second time, they didn't even bother to show much evidence. And on the first one, it was all about a phone call. And I'll remind you of that because I think we're going to have to remind people of that a lot over the next year and a half, because Joe Biden and the Democrats favored impeachment of Donald Trump because he asked Ukraine, would you please investigate the corruption that apparently involves some of your people and some of your companies in Ukraine, and it involves Americans as well. And they went after Donald Trump for that phone call. Well, what do we hear now? That there was activity by the Biden crime family in Ukraine involving millions of dollars. So now we have piles of evidence against Joe Biden. Why is the GOP turning coward when it comes to actually impeaching him? Tristan, welcome back to the program. Can you tackle that one for me?
Well, thank you for having me. Well, I think there was a lot of, Republicans were protesting in the first impeachment back in 2019 on institutional grounds. They were coming out saying, the entire impeachment was for political purposes. And I think there's a lot of hesitancy for Republicans on Capitol Hill now to pursue presidential impeachment because they don't want to. They're somewhat afraid of looking like some hypocrite. But I think that misses quite a bit of nuance here. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence to show that this scandal warrants far more of an impeachment inquiry than there ever was for Trump. You have two on-the-record whistleblowers coming out and saying that the FBI concealed critical documents from them in their federal tax probe of Hunter Biden, and you have the records coming out in public view that the FBI tried to hide from the American people and members of Congress. And so compare that to 2019 when you had an anonymous whistleblower who never came forward publicly, whose identity was concealed for months and months and months until after House Democrats passed their impeachment measure. And of course, they didn't come out themselves. They were unmasked by real clear investigations. On top of Democrats coming out and impeaching Trump for even mentioning Hunter Biden's connection with this corrupt Ukrainian energy firm. So I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that there's far more evidence to show that there warrants an impeachment inquiry of Biden than there ever was for Ukraine 4 years ago.
Well, and wouldn't it have made sense at the time if the whole issue was the phone call? And I don't think I'm overstepping it, that Donald Trump had a phone call. His essential request was, there appears to be corrupt activity going on in Ukraine. It involves Americans. Look into it. And they said, we're going to impeach him. Wouldn't one of the proper questions for Republicans at the time would have been to say, well, was there corrupt activity going on in Ukraine involving Americans? Except they all turned coward when it came to asking that question. If they had asked the question, and if they'd been forced to, if the Congress under Democrat control had been forced to consider the question, is there corruption going on in Ukraine that does involve American figures? They would have, I think, maybe not quickly, but they would have found out, yes, there appears to be corruption involving Hunter Biden and possibly Joe Biden as well. And now they're stuck with that result. And now they're saying we don't want to impeach because we might have to actually go after a president who might have taken millions of dollars from 3 different countries, from China, from Ukraine, from Moscow, all funneled through Hunter Biden to the Biden crime family. I mean, that looks like a mountain of evidence to most of us.
I give Republicans a lot of credit when it comes to the impeachment in 2019. I think Republicans, they did ask that question. They did do their due diligence on this. And when you look at the transcript of the phone call that Trump was immediate to declassify, by the way, you saw, all you have here is an American president who's asking his foreign counterpart to demand an investigation into that country's origins into peddling the Russia hoax, which did irreparable harm to the United States and especially U.S. foreign relations with our top adversary in Russia. So, one of our top adversaries, which is Russian. So, of course, now, fast forward 4 years later, we have an actual quid pro quo where Joe Biden even bragged about firing the top prosecutor in Ukraine who was investigating his son's energy firm there, who was paying him, millions in excess compensation. If you look at Hunter Biden's compensation from being on the board of Burisma, especially for someone who had no prior experience in the energy industry, it's way above comparable board compensation of members of other firms. And so you have this paper trail here, and it's still really just the tip of the iceberg. That FD 1023 from the FBI last week that was released by Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley is just the tip of the iceberg of a whole lot more to come. And now we have on-the-record whistleblowers who've come forward to corroborate some of the items in that document and some of the allegations about DOJ malfeasance. Again, compare that to in 2019, they were running the same type of operation that was using the same sources, the same contacts, and same techniques of leaking to complicit media as they did to peddle the Russia hoax.
Well, and imagine this. Imagine that Joe Biden, who back in 2020, when he was running, said, I have never discussed business with my son Hunter. And now apparently Devin Archer, a week from today, is scheduled to testify. I assume it'll be under oath. It'll at least be under a transcript. He's going to testify that Joe Biden joined conference calls with his son's business associates in Ukraine at least 24 times. So you've got a president who appears to have lied to the public through his teeth about having nothing to do. And now all the White House will say now is Joe Biden was not in business with his son. Well, that may be debatable as well. If all his son had to sell was dear old dad's influence as vice president, then how could he not be in business with him if his son was peddling his influence?
Well, I think it's much more than that. You have Devin Archer, who came out from the New York Post last night, who's prepared to testify that, like you said, Joe Biden was put into contact with Hunter Biden's associates, whether by speakerphone or in person, 2 dozen times. That's on top of the 80 logged visits to the White House and the Obama visitor logs. That's on top of the 100 scheduled meetings from Hunter Biden's online diary that were scheduled at the Naval Observatory. So now you have more than 200 documented interactions between Joe Biden and his son's business associates. And yet, throughout the entire 2020 campaign, the former vice president was claiming time and time again, even going as far as fat-shaming a voter in Iowa, that he had not spoken to his sons or anyone else about their business dealings. And of course, that's been proven demonstrably untrue. And yet you had Joe Biden even go on the presidential debate stage to peddle this routine conspiracy that all of his opponents were fabricating claims that were originated from the Kremlin.
I don't suppose there's any chance that Congress could actually ask Joe Biden to come and talk to them. I know they're going to say, well, that wouldn't be politic. But who better to know? Mr. President, if you said you never talked business with your son's associates, what were you doing on all these conference calls? I guess he can always claim senility at this point, but he's the guy who really should answer some questions. And yet, do the American people never get to hear from him?
Right. Well, according to them, it was all Russian conspiracy theory. And of course, a month and a half after the election, they admit that they're under a federal tax investigation. And now you have this plea deal, which, any sensible judge would throw out, especially after key whistleblowers come forward and say the most serious felonies were left off the table. And after we have evidence that the prosecutors in the Delaware U.S. Attorney's Office didn't have the authority to, under Merrick Garland's Justice Department to charge them with what they thought warranted the charges. And so I do think the president has questions to answer. I think members of the president's cabinet have questions to answer. I think Merrick Garland has a lot to answer for. And I think that's why you're seeing growing calls from Republican lawmakers not to just open up an impeachment inquiry on Joe Biden, but also Merrick Garland.
I think we should. And frankly, I don't think the Republicans have any more room. Over the last few months, Tristan, I've asked a few members of Congress, hey, why aren't you getting busy with an impeachment proceeding right now? And they said, well, we want to wait a while. I think they're dragging their heels for no reason whatsoever. The evidence is out there, and once Devin Archer testifies next week, if the Republicans still say they're not going to go after impeachment of Joe Biden, then the Republicans are worthless in my book. That is Tristan Justice, the Western correspondent for thefederalist.com. Tristan, it's always a pleasure. Coming up in a moment, I'll get to your phone calls and emails. I know a lot of you want to talk about Jason Aldean and the attempts to cancel one of the most popular artists in country music. And now Joe Biden wants to go after gas generators to make sure your lights stay turned on. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I'll get to the gas generators here in just a moment because Joe Biden is apparently going to, his government, the Biden administration, is going to go after gasoline generators now that we made America's electric grid so fragile that we're being told that 80% of the country could be in line for blackouts or brownouts sometime later on this summer, depending on power load and demand and supply and all the rest of that. Let me get to that in just a moment. But this Jason Aldean song thing bothers me because I've looked at the song. I've listened to the song. I've looked at the video. I've read the lyrics. I understand there's nothing racist in there. It is an all-American message saying, don't try your illegal criminal nonsense in a small town. Might work in the big cities, doesn't work in the small towns. Let's go to Josh. Hey, Josh, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Lars, it's good to talk to you again, brother.
Thank you, sir.
Jason Aldean song, if nobody has watched this, it's literally a good watch. It's a ballad, realistically. What people don't understand is there's nothing wrong with it. It is literally showing everything that's happened in the last couple of years that plays through the video. It plays through the riots. It talks about watching people spit in, cops' face. It literally shows everything that's been on, I'm going to use some of your words, the Chicken Little News Network, CNN, MSNBC. We've talked about this, privately. We've talked about this stuff before, is that the problem, what people don't understand is that they're getting mad by rebroadcasting their own faults. Okay, well, if you don't want to sit there and rebroadcast your own faults, don't do it. Don't act like an idiot, sorry my French, and sit there and then be all mad because somebody's put it into a song, into lyrics. It is literally talking about everything that's happened in the last couple of years, and now it's in their face, and they're like, oh but you can't do that. Lars, it is getting to the point that they're going to sit there, and now they're going to sit there and try to take away our barbecue time, sitting next to each other, drinking a beer, having a good time. You know that's coming, and that's the issue. You got a lot of these libtards that won't sit there and do anything besides cry and whine unless it's their way.
No, they have to be the victim. And let me tell you something, Josh. After I read the lyrics, after I looked at the video, I thought, I'm going to look at this, and I'll look at it through a racial lens, all right? And what I saw was Aldine singing. I see pictures of cops. You can't tell because they're geared up what race, in most cases, what gender they are. And then you see a white hand come into the shot in the first 30 seconds of the thing holding a Molotov cocktail. It's a white person holding the Molotov cocktail. And sad to say, an awful lot of the damage done by Antifa and BLM in the big cities of the last 3 years was done by young, white, privileged kids, a lot of them college kids. And they were not from the inner city. They were not poor and impoverished. They had the luxury of going out and raising Cain in somebody else's town because, they were missing a class, maybe. It wasn't because they were missing work. Actual working people couldn't afford to have taken that kind of time. And throughout the video, I didn't take time to count how many white faces, how many people of color in that, but I would say the vast majority of the people depicted doing the bad acts or confronting the police or spitting or throwing Molotov cocktails were white Americans. And sad to say, that was a lot of what happened.
Look at the deal. You're talking about the 30 seconds into the video. There's a white woman standing next to a front of a cop that you talk about all geared up and everything, spitting. And that's part of the lyric, talking about spitting and all that type of stuff. And all he's saying is that small town people, right, don't tolerate that. We sit there and we watch out for each other. You get into these big inner cities and all that type of stuff where it's, you talk about like Portland, Seattle, with the riots and everything else, they just let it go. They don't care anymore. But you come to a small town, we have to care because that's all we have. That is literally all we have. You go back east. I was just in Georgia here a couple months ago, and you talk about stuff like that. There's zero tolerance. But everybody's of every nationality, every creed, every race, everything. And they all believe in patriotic, watch out for each other because this is the only country we have. And if we don't, we're going to lose it.
One of the sad things about what I call the anonymity of big cities is that if you're in I went to high school in a small town, Tillamook, Oregon, right? Cheese factory and all that. 4,000 people in the town, 20,000 people in the county, more cows in the county than there are people. And if somebody decided to stage a protest, you want to stand on a street corner and shout or hold a sign, fine. You start breaking somebody's storefront window. When you live in a small town, you know most of those people. You've at least met them. And you say, well, you're breaking Fred's window or Susie's window. You're doing damage to my friends, to my neighbors, and so when you do that in a big city, if they're busting up, they busted up an Apple store, they took over an entire neighborhood, as you said, in Seattle with the Chop Zone. You say, well, I don't live there, and I don't know anybody who lives there, so all of a sudden you don't care as much. In a small town, you give a damn because those are your friends and neighbors. You know those people. You may interact with them at least once or twice a year, whereas in a big city, people tend not to care. And it's sad because then they get away with it.
It becomes personal. And that's where the problem is that's where we kind of lack in anymore is about personality. You get into it and you get into a small town or even some of these other rural towns and stuff. It's about personal. We work hard for what we have. And that's the bottom line is when you get into, look at Nike. All Nike wanted to do is sit there and be left side, left side, left side. Look at their store. Their store got destroyed by their left side people.
Yep.
Now tell me, you're not talking about you go into that board meeting, right? And you go, what do we do? What do we do? The store's gone. Half of downtown Portland's gone. Why? It's because they allow these people to come in there with zero consequences and then come out and go, oh, what do we need to do? Lars, I appreciate your time. I know you're extremely busy.
Thank you very much. Hey, Josh,
I just wanted to say what I said.
I appreciate the comments. Believe me, I appreciate the comments. Thank you very much. Let's go to Shad. Hey, Shad, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Oh, that Casey Caldine.
You like the song?
Oh, I love it.
As do
Yeah,
I.
you couldn't be more right.
And if anything, it ought to end up being an emblematic song of protest by everybody in America who believes in those small town values, whether they live currently in a small town or not. They understand you don't go after my friends, you don't go after my neighbors, knock it off.
Well, that is the truth. Stay out of my backyard, I'll stay out of yours.
Absolutely right. Chad, thank you very much. Hey, let me share this with you, though. The Biden administration has been on a jihad against gas stoves run by natural gas or liquid propane, propane stoves. They don't want them to exist because the greenies don't like it. They don't like the fact that people cook on gas stoves, that people heat their homes with gas. And now it turns out that the Biden administration wants to go after all gasoline-powered portable generators. I was just in a big box store over the weekend. I saw a guy wheeling one out of the store, and I thought maybe he's heard that the Biden administration is trying to ban these things altogether. And let me tell you something. I know people are going to say, well, they're not trying to ban them. Here's what the Consumer Product Safety Commission is proposing. They want to remove almost every existing gasoline generator from the market, and they're going to use a rule that goes after carbon monoxide, which means they'll make the argument to the public. They'll say, we're just having higher safety standards. Well, I think anybody who's ever dealt with a portable generator, and I certainly have. In fact, one of the first elementary schools I went to had a diesel generator because we were so far out in the woods that they didn't have any other way to make electricity for the school. It was a 3-room schoolhouse, and it was a great school to go to, but they had to fire up that generator every morning to make sure the lights turned on in the school. There was no off-the-grid electricity available. Well, the new rule is going to restrict the amount of carbon monoxide that those generators can emit, and they know that it's going to wipe out almost every portable gas generator available on the market now, and that's going to leave a lot of people in the dark at some point. Coming up, is the rise in hate groups a result of the left manufacturing their own bad guys? Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll get back to your phone calls and emails shortly. I want to talk to Tyler O'Neill. He's the managing editor at one of our regular reads, and that is the Daily Signal. Tyler, it's good to have you back on. How are you doing today?
Hey, doing well. Glad to be here.
So let me ask you this. Is the left forced, because of a deficit in villains, to go out and create some of its own villains, its own bad guys, its own boogeymen?
Yes. Well, I mean, I've been following the Southern Poverty Law Center for many years, even wrote a book about it. And it seems that is one of the main things that they do. I'm not sure if you've checked out the hate map lately. The SPLC puts out a map plotting conservative and Christian organizations alongside the Ku Klux Klan, branding them hate groups. And, some of the groups on this map, some of them are really bad. Some of them are good conservative groups that are being put on there to be slandered. And some of them barely exist at all, like Wildman's Herb and Surplus Shop, which did exist and was on the hate map for many years before they decided, I think they were shamed into taking it down. But you'll find some interesting stuff on there. There's also a shop called Luxor Couture. So they make their own villains in that way, but there's also a more subtle and disturbing way that they make their own villains, and that's what my recent article on gaslighting is all about.
See, what I'm concerned about, Tyler, is that I know the SPLC from decades ago when they occasionally did some good things. They went after Tom Metzger, who was a guy who talked a bunch of young kids, young teenage college-age kids into going out and beating people to death because of their skin color. I thought, okay, fine, you can go after those people. But like you said, when you start labeling groups, saying this is a good group, that's a bad group. Well, if a group, say a group of Christians, says we don't believe in gay marriage, we don't believe in a number of things that maybe are popular. So I don't care if they're popular or not. You have a right to say our group has a set of standards. We don't believe in that. You can believe in whatever you want to believe in. But for the SPLC to go around defaming groups, saying you're evil then because you won't endorse what popular culture thinks is perfectly okay, then the SPLC is just trying to defame people, I assume, to raise money.
Yeah, to raise money and to scare them into silence. It's interesting. For years they've had Alliance Defending Freedom on the hate map, and ADF, they claim that it's demonizing gay people. What ADF is really doing is representing people's religious freedom in court, and not just any court, but the actual Supreme Court. And this is
winning.
Religious freedom, free speech. Yeah, and winning over and over and over again. Most recently, Lori Smith's case in 303 Creative. I'm originally from Colorado, so it kind of struck a nerve with me. But the basic nature is these people just want to be left alone. Lori Smith wants to be able to choose which cases she celebrates, or which marriages she celebrates, weddings. She wanted to do a graphic design website for them, and Colorado law would force her, if she was going into the wedding business, to design websites for weddings she didn't approve of. And so that's a very clear First Amendment case. But many on the left like to say that that kind of thing is hate, and the SPLC is really the tip of the spear at redefining a lot of conservative causes as hateful. And President Biden, the resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, has met with the SPLC at least 6 times in the past 2 years, and his staff have met with SPLC 11 times. And he also nominated an SPLC attorney to a top federal judgeship. So this organization, it's not as it's very in the loop with the people who are in power right now.
Well, and Tyler, is the SPLC not aware that even Joe Biden's own vice president has described him as being an unrepentant racist? That he's made comments like, if you aren't voting for Joe Biden, you ain't black, and crazy stuff like this. But they'll embrace somebody like Joe Biden and then go out and call a Christian group evil because they say, we don't believe in this. We don't want to sanction gay marriages. Well, that's their right. To say we choose not to participate, and it's Lori Smith's right to say, if you want to ask me to do something creative and create a website, I get to choose who I create websites for. And you could imagine that in a lot of other contexts other than gay marriage, because if somebody came to her and said, "Hey, I want a website that celebrates Adolf Hitler's birthday," she said, "No, I don't believe in that. I don't have to make a website for you." And yet they're trying to portray her as then a hater because she won't participate in something she doesn't believe in.
Exactly. And she said she won't participate in racist messages or other messages that actually hate people, which is kind of ironic because the SPLC is essentially claiming that ADF representing her is hate. But yeah, I think we see also this tactic when Biden, runs roughshod over the Constitution with his, so-called student debt forgiveness, really a big handout to a lot of current and recently graduated students at the expense of all other Americans, either those who paid off their debt or who decided not to go to college, partially to save money. He goes and changes the law, and then when the Supreme Court rightly says, no, you can't do this, he acts like a toddler having a temper tantrum, blames the Republicans who filed the lawsuit, and blames the Supreme Court, which upheld the law.
Well, and frankly, Tyler, only one misstatement that I'd call you out on, but it's in support of your argument. Joe Biden didn't change the law. He could have. He could have walked over to the U.S. Congress and said, "Hey, you guys are both houses are still in the control of Democrats. Would you take the HEROES Act, which was originally intended for first responders and members of the military after 9/11? Would you mind adding Starbucks baristas who got a bad degree, a master's of fine arts, and still owe $50,000 on it, and found out that their only day job is pouring coffee? Would you mind adding them to the first responders and the men and women in uniform it was intended for?" Except he never bothered to do that. He could have. Now, I have a feeling that even sensible Democrats would have said, Joe, don't ask us to do this. We'd like to keep our jobs, and we won't be able to explain why Starbucks baristas who have a Master of Fine Arts are in the same category as people who put on a uniform and picked up a gun and got shipped off to Afghanistan or Iraq back in the day. They're not in the same category at all. But he didn't even bother to do that. Tyler, we're going to have to read Tyler's pieces. He is the managing editor at the Daily Signal and the author most recently of Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Tyler, it's a pleasure to have you on the program anytime. In the meantime, I'll get to your calls in the next segment. 866-HEY-LARS. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Answer our Twitter poll @LarsLarson Show. And if you care to, tell Alexa to play the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Monday. Yes, I took a week off. Tina and I took a little road trip with my 7-year-old granddaughter. I'll tell you what, you got to get out there and see this country. It is beautiful. And don't bother just flying over it from coast to coast. No, you got to see the real America. That's in the middle. In any case, glad to be with you on a Monday. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. And, of course, a shout out to our friends in Lansing, Michigan, who listen to Great Talk Radio on WILS. That's AM 1320. And of course, you can find my show Monday through Friday. Our Twitter poll today: do remote workers work even harder than those back in the office? A study out, they studied 60,000 Microsoft employees in the first half of 2020. Remember when at-home work became very, very popular because of the crazy government shutdowns during the pandemic? They actually found that remote work triggered a 10% boost in the weekly hours that every single worker put in. And a second study, the study showed a 13% boost in performance for at-home workers. I don't see a problem with it if it works for you. And if you've got an employee that you can't trust out of your sight, you probably have a bad employee to begin with. Think of all the workers who on a regular basis are out of sight of the boss. They're in a truck. They're in a vehicle. They're on a piece of equipment. If you can't trust them to do the job without you looking over their shoulder, I would suggest you probably don't have a good employee to begin with. Find the Twitter poll @LarsLarsonShow and at LarsLarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined years ago. You should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Let's start with a naysayer, because we always put naysayers to the head of the line. Always have, always will, have done it for more than a quarter century. Matt, calling in from Nevada, listening on KKFT. Hey, Matt, what do you and I disagree about today?
Hey, Lars. I don't understand why we're giving attention to Jason Aldean's controversy.
Why are we giving attention to it? Because there are people who want to silence anybody who says things that the politically correct left believes in. And I get concerned about that happening to me. Yes.
Lars, do those people buy Jason Aldean tickets? They don't.
Probably not, but can I tell you...
Lars, let me ask you this, Lars. When Kid Rock shot those Bud Light cans, did his stock go up or down? It went up.
Oh, it went up.
That's Trumponomics.
Okay, but can I tell you something?
Jason Aldean is benefiting. So why are you making this controversy?
He is now, but Matt, let me tell you something.
You are dividing the nation.
I'm trying to answer your question, but if you don't want to hear it, that's okay.
Content?
Matt,
I
give attention. I'm trying to answer your question, but if you don't want me to answer, I'll just shut up till you're done.
Lars, I'll let you talk. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just curious. You know the controversy over Target. Do you think Target understood who its audience was, who its customers were?
I think Target, and I'm not an economist, but I think they could have 50-50 liberal conservatives.
No, that's not what I asked. I just said, do you think they know who their
audience isn't affected?
I'm not but here's the problem, Matt. Do you think that most of them
to liberals?
Well, I'll let you
finish. Listening to liberal complaining?
No.
Don't listen to them.
Well, yes, because
ignore them. Jason Aldean is going to be fine. He's going to make money off it.
Can I tell you what's going
to?
And you've said that. Say it 4 or 5 more times if it gets it out of your system. If you want to hear an explanation, I'll be glad to offer it. If you don't, then that's okay.
Absolutely.
Say so.
No, let's hear it.
The reason I brought up Target has suffered massively, and I've occasionally shopped at Target. I don't any longer. But guess who's calling the shots? Ordinarily, if you have a business, you know who calls the shots? The business owner and the customers of that store. So if the business owner puts out product his customers don't want, then the customers stop coming, and either the owner of the store wises up or he doesn't, and he goes out of business. But now you got a third player involved, and that is investment companies that say, we're not going to support you, Target, unless you change your policies to reflect DEI, CRT, and the whole other alphabet of garbage that's out there. So if you'd asked anybody who ran a Target store, a general manager, do you think it'll be popular to put out girls' swimsuits with places for little boys to tuck their private parts? I think most managers would say, what are you, crazy? Our customers don't want that. That's going to be warm and fuzzy to about 2% of the population, and the rest of the people are going to see it and walk right out of the store. But why did they do it?
I
think they did it because of the big investment companies that own big chunks of their stock. They're the hidden players. So what happens, Matt, when Jason Aldean says, hey, I'm going to sign a new deal with a company to do 3 more albums, and then the company is told by its investors, oh, I'm sorry, we own 20% of your stock. Don't you sign Jason Aldean to anything. So in other words, while people make... Go ahead. Go ahead.
The line. He's Jason Aldean. He's not Bud Light. He has his market. He's not gaining or losing. He has his market,
but Matt, maybe you don't understand that in the record.
Liberals.
Fair enough. Matt, thank you very much. You got to be a naysayer, and I appreciate the call. Let's go to Don in Florida. Hey, Don, welcome to the Lars Larson Show.
Good evening, Mr. Larson.
What's up?
Well, I heard you talk about the Biden administration is trying to regulate out of existence gasoline-powered generators.
They are.
Yes, sir. That struck a chord with me. I'm a long-time listener. It's the first time I've called.
Thank you.
And you're welcome, sir. Thank you for what you're doing. My brother and I bought property in North Florida that was relatively cheap because there's no electricity back here. So we use generators and solar panels.
Yep.
And it's about 95 degrees in Northwest Florida right now. I'm actually sitting in my house running an air conditioner powered by a generator.
Good for you.
So, yes, sir. So I'm sitting here. I'm also looking for a manually operated propane stove, and I hear they're trying to regulate that out of existence.
They are.
Well, Mr. Larson, let me ask you this. You know that in this part of Florida, or all of Florida, is a hurricane-prone area.
Yep.
When Hurricane Katrina came through, in the weeks and days following that, all you could hear were generators running throughout the whole town of Pascagoula, Mississippi.
People had to save what was in the fridge and the freezer, right?
Exactly, sir. That's very correct. Well, if they get rid of gasoline-powered generators, what are we supposed to do?
Suck it up. That's going to be the bottom line. They're going to tell you, put enough solar panels on your roof. That'll be their answer. Yeah. They have this religion of environmentalism, and it really does. They behave as though it's a religion. And if the Catholic Church tells you, fish on Friday, no steak, then you do it. And you don't question, does this make any sense? You just say, we have to do it. When they tell you you're not allowed to have a propane stove, you're not allowed to have a gas generator, sit there and sweat and eat your dinner cold. I guess it's sit down and suck it up, or tell them, you don't tell us what to do. We tell the government what to do. Don, I appreciate the call. You got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I'm well aware that I'm older than dirt, but when I went to college a long time ago, for about a year and a half, I remember colleges used to say, we're going to bring you in. You're going to hear professors of all kinds of different points of view and backgrounds. You may have somebody who's a Marxist. You may have somebody who's a capitalist. I doubt there were too many who had labeled themselves fascists, but you'll get all the points of view, and you're going to hear all those points of view almost every single day. Well, today, not so much. And in fact, there's a brand new survey out among students about whether or not professors should be able to speak about offensive topics. And I would say that offensive probably is in the eye of the beholder. Let's get Professor Nicholas Giordano on, professor of political science at Suffolk Community College, host of the PAS Report podcast, and a fellow at Campus Reform's Higher Education Fellowship. Professor, welcome back. Is it now the case that students think that professors should have speech police on campus?
Well, thank you for having me, Lars. And yes, it's not only speech police on campus, but it's speech police throughout the United States. I mean, we're seeing a skyrocketing number of young people, millennials and Gen Z, in fact, a majority of them, and a slight majority of them, that want to reform the First Amendment to ban what they deem as offensive speech. And this is all a result of the college campuses and the indoctrination that goes on at the Leadership Institute's campus reform. We've been warning about this since its inception in 2009, and we're now seeing the results, right? We have an entire generations, 2 generations, that are skewed in the mindset where 44% of millennials believe that we should criminalize misgendering someone. 1/3 of Gen Zers actually believe that we should put government surveillance cameras in people's homes. And only 25%, fewer than 25% of millennials and Gen Zers, college students, have a favorable opinion of capitalism.
Now, hold on. Don't most of these kids plan to have a job when they leave college? And aren't most jobs with capitalist enterprises? I realize a few will be NGOs or government, but the rest of it's capitalism, isn't it?
Well, not particularly. If you look at this new crop of students that are graduating and going into the industries, they've been indoctrinated with the belief that capitalism is a bad thing, that it's selfish, it's greedy, it's responsible for death and destruction. In fact, you had a professor at Columbia University tell their students that capitalism was a direct result, that it was because of capitalism that world wars started and slavery became about, ignoring the tens of millions, over 100 million deaths that socialism and communism has brought the world. It really is remarkable. You have a Marquette professor talking about how individual liberty creates capitalist violence, and we reported this at Campus Reform. So what's your solution to eliminate liberty? And that's exactly what they do. Just look at the results. Look at Bud Light's ill-fated Dylan Mulvaney campaign. The vice president of marketing was a 2013 Wharton graduate that forgot the first rule of business: know your customer. And she cost the company $27 billion in market value. But that has real consequences, because how many Americans in their 401ks, in their IRAs, in their deferred comp plans, how many Americans have shares of Bud Light in their portfolios and don't even realize it? So we're seeing real-world consequences of what happens when you create ideological zealots. They graduate, and then they go into the corporate world, or they go into government and the bureaucracy and weaponize the bureaucracy based on ideological grounds. Well, this is a result of the college campus. That's why people need to care what's going on in the education system.
You know what I wonder about, Professor, since you brought up this ESG, and I guess even the folks who are pushing ESG, environmental and social governance, are now backing away from even using the terminology. But if it were just a matter of saying, I would like to invest in certain industries and not in others, I think everybody should have that choice. The problem is some of the players are so big that they can literally define, what a company is allowed to do. And, because if you want to divide the world up to where conservatives will invest in all the sensible things and the liberals can invest in whatever they want, no matter how crazy or uneconomical it is, go ahead, invest in all those things. That's okay. We'll get richer. You'll get poorer. That'll be fine. But they don't want to do that. They want to force everybody else to kowtow too. Hence, they go to state pension plans and say, we want to invest all your money, but we're going to invest it with DEI, CRT, ESG, and all the rest of this nonsense. And you say, but what if I want to be invested in those things that make money legally, whether it's pharma, whether it's tobacco, whether it's oil, whether it's nuclear power? I want to be invested in all those things. Oh, no, those aren't ESG. We're not going to invest in those things. They'll effectively take all the choice away from Americans in where they want to put their money.
Well, that's actually a great point. In New York State's pension system several years ago, they actually got rid of all the portfolio that was dealing with oil and gas and stuff like that. And the New York State Comptroller's Office actually did a study saying the only people that got hurt in that was actually the pension holders. So we ended up hurting ourselves here in New York State, and that's going on throughout the country. And that's the danger, that it does become this ideological. I mean, listen, capitalism has raised millions of people out of poverty into the middle class. Capitalism has saved lives. That's the fact. But we're seeing a morphing. We're no longer a capitalist society. We're one of the heaviest regulated economies in the free world. They look at it, constantly pointing to what it means. So democratic socialism, which isn't a real thing, but they'll point to that. Those countries rank higher on a capitalist scale than we actually do. So you're right to say you have these people that are weaponizing a capitalist, or what's supposed to be a capitalist system, to push political agenda. Then you have all these young students graduating, going to these companies, filling the HR rooms, where you have Coca-Cola doing try and be less white trainings, and Disney pushing a quote-unquote not at all gay agenda, not too subtle gay agenda. And you actually see the results where they don't know how to separate their ideology from their actual job. When I was in emergency management, I never said during an incident, well, we need to prioritize Republican areas and send them more resources than the Democrat areas. I did my job. We took care of the American people. It didn't matter what your politics were. I didn't care about politics when I'm doing my job. I didn't butt heads with Cuomo's office saying, no, I'm a conservative, and that goes against my conservative beliefs. We had a mission to do, and we got it done. Unfortunately, those days are gone. Now we have a bunch of bureaucrats that are ideologically corrupt. We have people in industry ideologically corrupt, and it's because they've been indoctrinated and haven't really been taught about American values of liberty and freedom. We don't have a civics program that's geared to teach them about America and our institutions and the roles and responsibilities of institutions, and why the founders believed that limited government was the best form of government. Why they warned us about ceding power and authority to government. Unfortunately, today, those students don't have that belief, and these are the future policymakers. These are the future leaders of industry.
You're breaking up just a little bit, Doc, or Professor, if you got nearer a window or whatever. But, this is the thing that floors me. I mean, if you think about simple capitalism, a company that sells tires for automobiles, you want to be ESG? Fine. Stop selling all truck tires, stop selling SUV tires, stop selling luxury car tires, and only sell cars to high-efficiency, tiny little economy cars, and electric cars as well, and see how well you do. And let the other company sell all the tires for the SUVs, the pickup trucks, and the gasoline and diesel-powered rigs, and see which company is doing better economically at the end of the year. I predict that the one that restricts itself from all the real vehicles out there and says we're only going to do economy cars and Teslas, that they're probably going to be broke and all their employees will be forced to go to work for the other company.
I think we actually see that, right? Americans don't want to give up their SUVs. They enjoy their SUVs. They're not willing to give it up. And we see that in order to entice people to buy these electric vehicles, the government has to offer enormous subsidies. And at the same time, they have to pass laws to force you to buy those vehicles because nobody wants them.
Yeah, they come and take your money at the point of a gun, the IRS does, and then they give the money to somebody to buy a car that doesn't make any sense. I mean, in a lot of ways, Professor, a lot of electric cars are like that kid who is so ugly the family had to tie a pork chop around the kid's neck to get the family dog to play with him. That's what electric cars are right now. Maybe someday it'll be different. That is Professor Nicholas Giordano from Suffolk Community College. Back with your phone calls in a moment. You got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. Our Twitter poll today, and this has to do with a couple of studies that have been done recently, because I remember when a lot of us ended up working remotely, and I do today. I work remotely in a studio. I used to go to a studio at a company, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But the question was, if you're working remotely, are you as productive as you would have been if you actually showed up at an office? They say that a study of 60,000 Microsoft employees found that remote work triggered a 10% boost in the number of hours that each worker put in on average. Remote employees are working more, in part because they are commuting less. Another study based on data from 27 countries found that remote work saves about 72 minutes a day in commuting time. On average, employees spend about an extra half an hour of that extra time engaged in daily work more than 2 hours a week. Not only do remote workers log longer hours, they also seem to get work done at a faster clip. An off-cited pre-pandemic study of workers at a Chinese travel agency found a 13% boost in performance for home workers. They worked more hours per shift, and every hour was a bit more productive, and there's nothing wrong with that either. To your calls now. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and we always put naysayers to the head of the line. Let's go first to Paul in Minnesota. Hey, Paul, welcome to the program. I take it you heard us talking about Jason Aldean's song called Don't Try That in a Small Town.
Yeah, and I really resonated with the message. Every time I call you up, I always try to give you some kind of practical advice that people can use in their own daily lives to try to convince others why they should change their mind and have a new view of the world. And I'm not really a naysayer. What I would like to actually give you is just some practical advice that maybe some of your listeners can use. And
give it to me as long as you don't mind if I push back if I think it's appropriate.
Yeah, not a problem. I mean, for me, it's appropriate. For you, I don't know if it's going to go the same way. But the thing that he's talking about in the video where the cities are completely under riot control practically, where everybody's just doing destruction of property and going out there and hurting other people if necessary. I mean, they see somebody just walking down the sidewalk, they'll just take a swing at them. And totally inappropriate in a small town. That obviously wouldn't happen. There'd be a lot of pushback. In the cities, you have the politicians pulling back the police instead and saying, don't hurt those people. All they're doing is causing destruction of property, even if people are getting hurt in the process. And the suggestion that I'd like to give to you and your viewers is to actually change your mindset and start considering shoplifting and destruction of property like that. Start considering that as violence. The left always likes to go out there and talk about how speech is violence. If you're saying something hurtful to someone, well, that's violence. Well, start considering destruction of property and shoplifting and everything else as violence. And violence can be met with violence. You can fight back. You can hurt people who are committing violence in that way as well. And that's my thought.
I'd be careful with that, and I'll tell you why. Because if somebody came to steal my stuff, I would clearly want to stop them from stealing my stuff, whether it's in a store. I don't own a store, but if I did, if I told the police they were taking my stuff, so I shot them, use of deadly force against theft of property is a bad argument. I mean, it's a tough one to make in front of a jury to say this guy was going to take some stuff, so I shot him and killed him. If you said that guy was about to hurt me or hurt a member of my family or hurt a stranger, and I decided the only way to stop them was use of deadly force, that would be one you could justify. But and I do agree with you to some extent that theft of people's property, especially people who are not wealthy people, if you're a person of average means or even below average income, and somebody steals your car, that may be your livelihood. That may be the way you pick up your kids from school or go to the grocery store and get groceries for your family. It may be the way you get to your job. If you take that car, oftentimes not an expensive car, and oftentimes not a car covered by insurance that'll replace it if it's stolen, then you've done a lot of violence to that person in the sense you're offering up, because you're saying to that person, I just took the way you get to work. You can't get to work anymore, or you may have to get there on a bus or go there on foot. And that becomes very difficult. It hurts people a lot because, and I do understand the argument that way, but if you said I saw a guy shoplifting, so I knocked him to the ground and punched him in the head, you're going to have a tough time making a self-defense case in that case. Does that make sense?
I disagree entirely, Lars. I think if you actually took that before a jury, you might not get all 12 people to agree with you, but I think you'd get at least a few, enough to cause a hung jury, and that would be enough to start a landslide where people actually start saying, well, you're taking my stuff, you're committing a felony, so I can therefore do the exact same thing that you're doing except to your body. I mean, if your body is your property, then all I'm doing is hurting your property back. And yeah, I think a lot of people would
I'm just going to tell you, though, I'll bet I'll get a call. I'll get at least a call or emails from lawyers who will say, if I say somebody was about to hurt me physically or hurt somebody in my family physically, and I used force to stop them, a jury would not. But they're going to be instructed by the judge that if you say, I was justified in committing violence against them because they were taking stuff from me, property crime is what the cops call it, the judge is going to instruct the jury, and the jury's going to have a tough time not finding you guilty in that case. I understand the argument you're making. But see, I think Aldean's approach to this was not that at all. What he was saying was sucker punch somebody on a sidewalk, carjack an old lady at a red light, pull a gun on the owner of a liquor store. Yeah, you all think it's cool. Well, act like a fool if you like. And what he's saying is when you're doing violence to people, I mean, a gun on the owner of a liquor store has a very good, the reason we punish armed robbery more severely than strong-armed robbery or non-armed robbery is because there's a great potential for people to get hurt. So in the lyrics, he focuses on things where you're hurting people. And he says, you know, you spit at a cop, you cuss out a cop, spit in his face, stomp on the flag and light it up. Yeah, you think you're tough. I mean, he's just saying that in a small town, if you do that kind of thing, you are likely to be met by a number of people who know the law, and they are law-abiding citizens, and they're going to stop you from doing it.
Well, let me respond to that, because I think the way that you're thinking about it is exactly why you're not solving the problem.
Because I'm not saying that if you take my stuff, I can shoot you dead?
No, because you can't, because you're saying it's not violence, even if the left is already claiming that
I'm not saying it's
violence.
not.
I'm saying take a step further and start saying, well, if you're going to start calling that violence, I'm going to start calling this violence. Now you go defend that because I'm going to use it against you anyways. And I think there's a lot of people that do agree with that. It's just not being spoken enough to actually get into the mainstream.
I'll tell you what, it's a reasonable argument. I'm just going to tell you, I think legally it may fail. But let's see what Joe in Michigan has to say. Hey, Joe, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Lars, thanks a lot for taking the call. Hey,
sure.
I'm just hearing this gentleman here that you're talking to about, you know, the use of force based off, you know, theft and whatnot. I don't necessarily agree with heavy force for theft because nobody's life's in danger, but I understand the point he's trying to get across. But one thing that you mentioned in that call when I was listening, I do listen to you all the time, by the way. I do enjoy your call.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Podcast very much. But as you mentioned that, you know, if somebody was to steal something from somebody that is wealthy and more well-to-do, you know, that might not be as serious as taking something from somebody that's not as well-to-do, you know, because it's their livelihood. I don't know if that's quite the message that you possibly were looking to send because, you know, typically it doesn't seem like you'd support it being more okay to take from somebody that, you know.
No, I'm not saying it's more okay to take anybody's stuff under any. What I'm saying is, Joe, if somebody steals my car right now, it's fully insured. I call an insurance agent. I've got another car tomorrow. For you take that $5,000 transportation car from the man or woman who doesn't have the money to own something nicer and doesn't have full insurance on it, you just took their livelihood. And so it has a greater consequence for those people. Neither one is okay. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday, and yes, I was gone for a week. I was on vacation. I took Tina and my little granddaughter, Payson, who's 7. We went on a road trip because we like showing Payson the real America, not the kind you get when you get in an airplane and fly from one coast to the other. That's kind of boring. What we wanted her to see was real America, northern Idaho. And boy, did we have a great time, and I think she had a great time, and we made it educational as well. A lot of that. So, but not boring. I mean, we're not the kind of people who just turn a trip into, okay, we're going to have a history seminar. But there was a lot of history involved. In any case, glad to be with you on a Monday. Always glad to take your calls. Economic experts are now calling out President Biden for touting the success of Bidenomics and taking credit for low unemployment and decreasing inflation. Joe Biden spoke to a crowd of union supporters at the Philly shipyard in Philadelphia last Thursday, as polls showed that voters are not convinced the economy is improving. Forbes media chair Steve Forbes said on Friday he was amazed by the administration's talk about the economy. The president delivered a full-throated defense of Bidenomics, claiming credit for bringing down inflation, slashing the federal budget by $1.7 trillion, and creating 13 million new jobs. In June, Biden made the same claim about cutting the deficit by 1.7 trillion, which even the Washington Post, the liberal Washington Post, called that highly misleading, which means a polite way of saying Joe is lying. Let's go to Ed in Nevada. Ed, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, I want to talk about this song that Jason Aldean did.
Yep.
It's I live in rural Nevada. I'm about 3 miles from a small town of about 3,000 people. And a couple of years ago, during our summer of almost peaceful riots, some people were going to come out to our town. Well, I'll tell you what, I was a bunch of business owners that sat in front of their stores with shotguns over their laps and a rocking chair.
That would do it.
See how we are. But we look after each other out here because we have to. I see a guy broke down alongside the road. I stop and make sure he's got phone service so he can get help.
And that's the way to get it done, Ed. And I think that's in the song when he refers to good old boys. He's talking about people like you. You know what the law is. You know the right things and the wrong things to do for your fellow citizens, and you don't want that kind of nonsense being done. So you make sure that gets corrected, and that's all he's talking about. And he gets attacked for doing that.
Exactly. I don't care what your skin color is. Mine happens to be light because I'm of European descent. But if you're broke down alongside the road, I pull over. I don't care what your skin color is. If my neighbor down the road, he's a little darker than I am, and we get along just fine. We barbecue together. We have beer together. We have a good time together. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, Ed, and that's just what Jason Aldean is doing. And I think the reason he's being attacked by the left in America is they realize that anthems like the one he wrote, Don't Try That in a Small Town, are going to resonate with so many Americans of every color, of every religion, of probably every sexuality, that they're going to say, hey, that makes sense. That's the way I want things to be. And for that, he gets attacked. And I know I had the caller earlier who said, Lars, you're drawing more attention to this. He's doing just fine. I'm going to tell you something, Ed. When people like Jason Aldean, I don't know the man, but I admire his music. But when people like him get attacked, some of the attacks are things you can't see. For example, somewhere in companies, there are folks making decisions. Do we sign this artist to another deal for 3 more albums or not? Do we let his videos play on country music television, which they ripped his video down? And those decisions are largely done out of the sight of the public. You may not even know they've happened, and yet they have tremendous consequences, like telling people your stuff is no longer on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, or whatever. Those have gigantic consequences, and you got to push back against this kind of nonsense. Otherwise, they will have the ability to intimidate people. And frankly, Ed, self-censorship is the most dangerous kind. It's not the overt kind where the government comes in and says you're not going to be allowed to put those words on a sheet of paper or on the internet or on put them in a movie. It's the self-censorship that happens when people like Jason Aldean or his producers or the people he has his record deal with say, you know what, we don't want to have any contact with him because if we do, some of our investors will cut us off. That's the dangerous kind. So what happens is people just self-censor. I mean, I'll bet there are plenty of people in Hollywood. I've only met a couple of people from Hollywood who are actors and actresses who say there are certain projects they won't do. There are certain movies they won't do. Why? Because they're afraid that if they do them, they'll get blackballed. And what's kind of ironic is in the 50s, when they had the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, there were an awful lot of actors, and the left took this up as a big cause. They said, hey, you've silenced people by saying so-and-so is associated with the Communist Party. And in many cases, it turns out they were associated with the Communist Party. And then, consumers could have made their own decisions about whether or not they want to read that book or go to that movie. But they thought blacklisting people was absolutely evil. Today, the left has decided to use that very technique to effectively blacklist people and say, you'll never get your books published, you'll never get your music out there, and they are starting to control all of that, and that's dangerous to all of us.
I agree.
Ed, thank you very much. I appreciate the call. By the way, I got to tell you about this story. I did a little Instagram on it. If you want to check out our Instagram account, I'm on Instagram, The Lars Larson Show. But a friend of mine, Bennett Rowe, he's a firearms instructor, but he copied me on a note he wrote to the head of Lowe's, you know, the big home improvement store that's in competition with Home Depot. Here's what happened. In a little town, I think it's pronounced Rincon, Georgia. In Rincon, Georgia, there's a 68-year-old woman by the name of Donna Hansbrough. Donna Hansbrough was fired from her job. She had been with Lowe's for 13 years. And what happened was, this was about a month ago, just about a month ago, just a little less than that. Donna Hansbrough was working at her job at Lowe's, and she saw 3 people walk in, and they loaded up a shopping cart with all the things that are expensive that you can buy at Lowe's, power tools and things like that, about $2,000 worth of stuff. And she saw them heading for the exit, and she realized they haven't paid for any of that stuff. They're about to steal that stuff. And she tried to stop them. This is a 68-year-old woman. As she tried to grab the shopping cart, all she was trying to do was not apprehend the bad guys, but just keep them from stealing the stuff. You know what happened? One of these thugs punched her in the face 3 times, gave her a black eye, and guess what Lowe's did? Lowe's fired her. They said, you're fired. You didn't follow our corporate policy. Their corporate policy is to let the thieves go and then pass the cost of all that stealing onto all their other customers. Shame on Lowe's for doing that. You got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday. Glad to be with you and always glad to take your phone calls and your emails. I want to talk about something involving a song. Before we get to all the other issues here in the Pacific Northwest, I want to talk about Jason Aldean's song. And the reason is, I think that cancel culture is starting to apply to far too many people in America. It doesn't make any sense. It is wrong-headed, and it actually sends the wrong message. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. Glad to have you on board. And if you want to join what we call the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you happen to be a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com and check out our Twitter poll. Today's question: do remote workers work even harder than those who stayed back in the office? I know a lot of you would say, no, you're at home playing with your kids and doing nothing. No, actually, there's a brand new study out, and I'll tell you more about it a bit later, that suggests that those who are working remotely, I happen to have a dog in the fight, I do that as well, but they actually work harder, and they turn in more hours because they're not spending a lot of time trapped on either transit or in an automobile. Find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Now, about that Jason Aldean song. Jason Aldean is one of the biggest country music stars out there, and I happen to like country music as well as rock and roll. And he did a song. He actually released the song months ago. But then last week, I took a week of vacation, took my wife and my granddaughter off for a little road trip. We like to do road trips, and we had some interesting experiences on that. I'll tell you about those a bit later on. But during last week, they released a video of the song, and the song is called Try That in a Small Town. And frankly, I like the song because I've thought about it myself. When I've heard about things happening in America's bigger cities, like riots, Antifa and BLM torching the place, looting, arson, and even murder, I thought, well, might work in a big city, probably would not work in a small town. And in fact, I can cite at least half a dozen instances where Antifa or BLM tried to show up in a small town. But Aldean was smart. He wrote the song in which he makes no reference to race. He makes no reference to specific groups, as I just did. He just said, look, don't try that kind of stuff in a small town. Now, he released the song, as I said, months ago, but last week the music video came out, and guess what? CMT, Country Music Television, said we're pulling the video immediately.
And then they refused to explain why they were pulling the video. So, cancel culture has called. They've made accusations of racism. The song does not mention race in any way, shape, or form. I want you to hear a little bit about it, and then I want you to consider whether or not we're now seeing a double standard put up, where people who say the right thing get punished, where people who say the wrong things get rewarded. And if that makes any sense to you, first take a listen. This is Jason Aldean from that song, Try That in a Small Town.
Cuss out a cop, spit in his face, stomp on the flag and light it up. Yeah, you think you're tough? Well, try that in a small town. See how far you make it down the road.
Yeah, the music is very simple. The message is very simple. Well, his label is Broken Bow Records, released on Friday, July the 14th. It was in rotation on country music television until they suddenly just pulled it off and would not explain why. Although I think all of us can listen to that and say, I understand what's going on there. The message is one that would resonate with most Americans. Americans, I think, are sick and tired of all the nonsense, all the riots, all the looting, all the arson, all the demands for defund the cops, release the criminals, don't prosecute people anymore. Well, Aldean was hearing a lot about that. And over the weekend, I think this was Friday night, he was at a concert and he actually talked to the audience about what was happening. Take a listen to what he said.
Everybody having fun so far tonight? Well, I gotta tell you guys, man, it's been a long ass week. It's been a long week, and I've seen a lot of stuff. I've seen a lot of stuff suggesting I'm this, suggesting I'm that.
Crowd didn't like that.
Hey, here's the thing. Here's one thing I feel. I feel like everybody's entitled to their opinion. You can think something all you want to. It doesn't mean it's true, right? So, what I am is a proud American. I'm proud to be from here. I love our country. I want to see it restored to what it once was before all this bullshit started happening to us. I love my country, I love my family, and I will do anything to protect that. I can tell you that right now.
Yeah, I tell you that right now. And that's the message that resonates. And the political left can't stand it. They absolutely went bananas. In fact, over the weekend, I was getting a lot of emails from a lot of you who said, are you going to talk about this? And about the accusations that somehow the lyrics were racist, that the lyrics support lynching, that this is aimed at a derogatory message toward black or brown people in America. Well, it's easy enough to pull the lyrics of songs up. I did exactly that. I looked at the lyrics of the songs. There's nothing in them that refers to race. There's nothing in them that refers to religion. There's nothing in them that refers to national origin or any of the rest of that. That's the problem, is that when you say something and the political left realizes that message is actually going to make sense, it's going to actually, resonate with people. Well, guess what? Rolling Stone, which is one of the biggest. I don't particularly like the editorial stance of Rolling Stone. They've been caught lying too often. They blasted Aldean's song this past weekend and the video, even though that very same publication has supported disgusting lyrics like Ice-T's Cop Killer, a song that actually calls for going out and killing police. It celebrates gang and thug life. But Ice-T is black and Jason Aldean is white. Take a listen to one more short bite from the song, because I think the song actually makes sense. And it's something a lot of us have thought about over the last 3 years of watching riots and looting and arson and murder in all kinds of towns, big and small, around America. Take a listen.
Got a gun that my granddad gave me. They say one day they're gonna round up. Well, that might fly in the city. Good luck. Try that in a small town.
And, of course, he mentioned guns as well, and that got the left going, too. I'd just like to get your take on it, because my take is the message makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. Don't try that stuff in small towns. And I'll bet some of you can also remember some instances over the last 3 years where certain groups like Antifa and BLM, not mentioned in Jason Aldean's song, but I would mention them, they showed up in small towns. And guess what?
They left with their tail between their legs, not beaten up, not hurt, not assaulted, but simply they found out that small towns in America will not put up with that kind of nonsense. Glad to be with you on a Monday. Always glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. And naysayers go to the head of the line. That's 866-439-5277. And you can send an email to talk@larslarson.com. Your phone calls and emails on the issues of the day coming up next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and emails. We'll do that in just a moment. But I want to tell you something. I tend to look at government from a very simplistic point of view. And that point of view is government is a service provider, or at least in theory, it should be. And you have to pay for the service. It's kind of like paying the electric company for the electricity that comes into your house. But if one day the electric company is charging you so much money that they're eating up most of your paycheck, at some point you might say, you know, we're going to have to deal without electricity because we can't afford it anymore. I think government is finally getting to that point where government at all the levels, federal, state, and local, is chewing up so much of everything America makes that it's becoming unaffordable. Now, my solution would be a much smaller government, and that might also be the solution that Romina Baccia has, who is the Director of Budget and Entitlements at the Cato Institute. Welcome to the program, ma'am.
Hi, Lars. Thanks so much for having me on.
I'm glad to do it. Now, let's make this simple for me. My audience may understand more than I do, but is government growing so fast that it has reached what the left love? They love the word unsustainable or sustainable. Is government spending becoming unsustainable?
Yes, I believe government spending is unsustainable and is growing more unsustainable the longer we wait to reform the largest drivers of spending. The problem is that neither of the two main parties, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, are even willing to talk about the programs that would need to be cut in order to make government sustainable in the long run.
Well, can we start with that? Because this frequently comes up on the program, and I tell people 2/3 of the federal budget is spent on what are called entitlements. Now, some people don't like that. But that's the term, because people say I'm entitled to Medicare. I did what you required me to do. I'm entitled to Social Security. So the term is entitlement. But there's a lot of other federal government spending. Could we cut enough of the rest of the federal government, as well as reforming those programs, to make enough of a difference so we don't get to, I think you've written that we're getting to the point where the U.S. government by 2053 will consume all of its own 30% of our entire economy. And they're not far from that now, are they?
That's right. We're almost at 25%, but it's looking to decline somewhat. So the government is now consuming about a quarter of the economy. And this is just looking at the federal government. You also have to add in state and local. At that level, we're much closer to 45% of GDP, which is almost half of the entire economy. So that's deeply troubling. And as the federal government is projected to grow to consume 30% of GDP over the next 30 years, state and local spending will likely grow along with that as well. So we may well find ourselves at a time where the overall government burden will be closer to half of the entire economy will be gobbled up by the government. In terms of what do we cut to prevent this scenario? Well, first of all, I think we should at least aim to get government back down to its historical average. The historical average over, say, the past 50, 60 years, government consumed about 20 to 21% of the economy, not 30%, which is where we're headed. So that's a significant increase, about 40% increase over the next 30 years if we don't change course. And, the big elephant in the room is really healthcare. And a lot of the cost growth in healthcare is driven by Medicare, but also the so-called Affordable Care Act subsidies and Medicaid. So without healthcare reform is really where we need to make significant cuts, because healthcare is growing faster than the economy each and every year, and that's one of the biggest drivers of the government growing to consume more of the economy.
Could we cut the cost of healthcare if we said, instead of making it free, in quote marks, scare quotes, where people say, well, I've got Medicare. I can go in, I can get anything I want, or anything that Medicare will offer me, and as much as I want. So there's no constraint on people's use of medical care, whereas with everything else in the economy, you don't buy steak unless you got a fat wallet, and you don't drive an expensive car unless you have a big budget, and you constrain your spending. But with health care, there's no constraint if somebody else is paying the tab, is there?
You're right, and that's one of the key issues with healthcare. But it's not just that people perhaps are consuming more healthcare than they would if they were paying for more of it out of pocket, but because the government plays such a large role in regulating the medical care system, in financing the medical care system, a lot of the care provided is actually wasteful from the perspective of not just the taxpayer, but also the beneficiary, where a lot of the care doesn't provide any benefits, and a lot of the cost gets eaten up by the administrative burdens imposed on our hospitals and our providers that also doesn't provide any real benefit. It's just paper burden. And so if we said, okay, all of the money that the government is currently providing in the form of health care, if we instead actually said, we don't need to cut a penny, let's just fix the current subsidy that the government provides and give it to people directly. Give it to them in health savings accounts, allow them to buy their own health insurance, not be dependent on their employer or Medicare or Medicaid, but let's just take the whole system and just hand it over to the people and give them control of it. I think we would see massive savings, even if we didn't cut a penny. Over time, we would see those savings, in part because if you fix the current subsidy, instead of allowing healthcare spending to grow ever more generous without budget controls, which is the course that we're currently on, it would actually fix most of the cost growth problem, about 2/3 of it. So you could maintain the current level of health subsidy and just turn it over to people directly, and they would make better choices, and they would likely get better care, better value at lower cost.
See,
and
I love
why not
that
let
idea.
them pocket the savings?
Yeah, Romina, I love that idea. If you said to people, look, here are your health care dollars. Okay, what do you want to do with them? I want to buy a catastrophic policy to protect me against, cancer, heart disease, train wreck, whatever it is, the big stuff. Let me take care of the small stuff. The premiums for that should be relatively small. They always have been, because it's like buying a car, and if you say I want $50 deductible on all collision, every time your car gets a scratch, you take it in and get it fixed. If you have $1,000 deductible like I do, you say I'm going to take good care of my car because if it gets scratched, I'm going to be paying most of the bill. So you take better care, and people might arguably take better care of themselves and say, I'm going to try to avoid going to the doctor because for all the little stuff, I have to pay for it out of pocket. But if something big comes along, I'm protected. So you get what they said they wanted to get you out of Obamacare, except it didn't really supply that. It supplied Cadillac coverage that nobody could afford.
Yes, I agree with you. And we have to question, who really benefits from the current system. And I don't think that it's the American people. I don't think it's the people that are supposedly, that we call the beneficiaries. I think the system that currently exists primarily benefits the bureaucrats that administer it for the federal government. It provides them with jobs, keeps them busy, and probably some of the larger hospital complexes and some of the larger organizations that are able to keep up with the flood wave of regulations and requirements that the federal government imposes in order to pay them as providers for Medicare and Medicaid services. And that industry probably has a lot to benefit from the current system that is very complex and doesn't put the patient at the center of it. The patient is almost an afterthought.
Well, to paraphrase Shakespeare, first we fire all the bureaucrats. That's Romina Baccia, who's Director of Budget and Entitlements at the Cato Institute. Romina, thank you very much. Glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com.
You can vote in our Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show, or you can go to my website. The vote counts the same at larslarson.com, and you can send an email to talk@larslarson.com. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll get back to your phone calls and emails shortly, even naysayers, because you know on this program, naysayers always go to the head of the line at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Vote in our Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show or at larslarson.com. And, of course, you can always send emails to talk@larslarson.com. Now, I want to talk about the Federal Trade Commission, and before you let your eyes glaze over, just understand how terribly significant this agency that used to be kind of a sleepy agency has now become to almost everything we do in America, because they make a bunch of rules and guidelines, and they don't necessarily go through the Congress to make that happen. Jessica Malusian joins me now, who's with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Jessica, welcome back, and describe what it is the FTC and the Department of Justice are up to now.
Well, I'm going to piggyback on your effort to not bore everyone to death about this, so we're going to explain it really quickly here and say that it's one thing if you bring a case in a court, but within the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, they can also bring cases against companies. So in this case, if two companies want to merge, they set out a set of guidelines and say, as long as your deal doesn't look like this, this, or this, we're probably not going to have a problem with you. But if your deal does look like this, this, and this, you might find yourself in court. We might be trying to stop your merger.
And they do this allegedly to protect the American consumer. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that, the road to hell, as they say. But, I certainly would never doubt the good intentions here. But the problems are really with the facts and the economics. So these guidelines just basically put the presumption on the side of this merger is not going to be good, as opposed to what we have been used to with the last 40 years, which is we're probably going to assume that these are good business decisions. They're going to usually benefit consumers unless we see a problem. So now we sort of flip that to them seeing a problem everywhere. And that's more of a European approach. And in fact, if these guideline draft goes into effect as they're written now, we would actually have a more strict regime for approving mergers here in the U.S. than they do in the European Union. So if that doesn't terrify everyone, I don't know what would.
Is there any evidence whatsoever that the FTC doing this actually does the consumer any good?
That's a great question. And really one of the problems with their approach right now is that they've taken their eye off the ball of looking out for the consumer, and now they're starting to look out for all these other things in mergers. What does it do to the labor? What does it do to equality and all these other sort of questions that, those might be reasonable questions for us to decide as business owners and employees, but it's probably not a good idea for the government to try to micromanage the whole economy, right? It used to just be, what is this going to do for innovation going to consumers and prices going to consumers? And now we're starting to blur that line a little bit and say, well, what happens to the workers and the labor? Again, not that that's not a consideration, but it's not supposed to be the point of antitrust law.
No, I would.
Yeah.
Jessica, in this case, it's Microsoft and Activision is the specific case they're looking at, right? And Microsoft's the big software company. They do a little bit of hardware, but mostly software. And Activision, am I slighting them if I say they're basically a video game maker?
Not at all. They're a very successful video game maker, but that's very accurate. Yeah, and they just got done. The FTC, of course, in-house, it has its own administrative court. But if you don't like those results as a business that's being challenged, you can take that case to a real live Article 3 court, the ones that we all have to deal with. And the FTC just got done losing their challenge to that deal. And, and it's for exactly the reasons we're talking about. There really wasn't any consumer harm in Microsoft buying a video game company. Actually, there was quite a bit of benefit that economists could prove. But what the FTC just didn't like about it is just, Microsoft's big and they don't like big. Big is bad is the new rule at FTC. And that doesn't make a lot of sense for the world's leading economy in 2023, right? We know that big isn't always the answer, but sometimes you need those economies of scale. You need those big guys to drive growth, to drive research and development, innovation, make jobs. We need to have all those sizes in our economy of businesses. And so it's sort of nonsensical to just punish a certain company just because it's over a certain size.
Well, and Jessica, just so people know my bias, I'm not a big fan of Bill Gates. I'm not necessarily a fan of Microsoft either. I think they do a lot of things that are wrong. I'm not a video game player, so I kind of don't have a dog in the fight on that side of it. And I don't always assume that big is better, but I also don't assume that big is necessarily going to win, because I can remember some real crash and burns that Microsoft has been involved in. Cell phones come to mind, and you say, well, they're gigantic and they know technology, so they'll obviously be the dominant cell phone maker. No, not so much. And in this case, buying Activision may make them the biggest player on the block, or they may end up like MySpace did when Facebook came along.
Yeah, well, in this case with Microsoft, they're not number one in the world, and the market here we're talking about is for gaming consoles. And they're the only U.S. company in the top three. So this was really kind of a boon for the U.S. economy that they're going to get this benefit of Activision. And Activision is famous, for all of you who don't play, like Lars and I, who also don't, Call of Duty. That's their big game that is a big deal to people who play. So that's actually really good for us globally. And the other thing to think about is these merger guidelines go way beyond the tech industry, way beyond gaming, into every industry. So these merger guidelines are about all kinds of mergers: grocery stores, airlines, health companies, all of that stuff. And it's not that there can't be problems there. It's just that the assumption shouldn't be there's automatically a problem, right? We shouldn't err on the side of that, because there's a lot of good that comes from these efficiencies, especially when these are called vertical mergers. So they're not two competitors buying each other. It's a company buying a company in its supply chain. And what that means is you have one less layer that consumers have to deliver a profit to. So often what we see is that prices come down for consumers when we have those vertical mergers along the supply chain.
Well,
so that the FTC is trying to fight that, it just makes no economic sense.
Well, and the other thing you mentioned about them being among the top three, Microsoft is the only U.S. company. Are the other companies that are in the top ranks of that end of the business, are they necessarily constrained in their home markets or in other markets around the world the way they would be here? So it's almost like we put handcuffs on the really good competitor, the really big competitor from America, and the other two companies don't have those same handcuffs. It sounds like America becomes less dominant altogether.
Yeah, we're definitely hobbling U.S. companies when we say that our standards here are even more strict and more oppressive than those in the European Union, which I'll point out has not one top 10 global tech company, and it's for a reason. In this case, we're dealing with Sony and Nintendo, and Sony has all sorts of deals, just like the one that Microsoft wants to be able to make with Call of Duty, and it's just complete hypocrisy to say it's okay for Sony or Nintendo to do, but it wouldn't be okay for Microsoft to do. It doesn't help anyone, except maybe Nintendo and Sony. And that's another thing. The FTC should be in the business of looking out for consumers, not looking out for competitors of these companies that might get stronger if they're allowed to merge.
No, and if we weaken American companies, and we're clearly in a global competition these days, and we effectively make the foreign companies stronger, that doesn't sound like it'll work out well for consumers at all. Jessica, thanks for what you do at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We always appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, ma'am. Jessica Malusian with us. We'll be back in a moment. Glad to get your phone calls and emails, and tell me what you think of that. As I said, I'm not a big fan of Microsoft or Bill Gates. I got a lot of criticisms for Bill Gates in particular. But if we start weakening American companies, and now we're going to be dealing with companies from Asia that may not exactly have America's best interests at heart and may not have the same hamstrung situation that Microsoft does that sound like it'll work out well for all of us? Because it doesn't sound like it to me. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday. Glad to be with you and always glad to take your calls. Our Twitter poll today: do remote workers work even harder than those back in the office? Now, I heard early on, as people began to go home and work from home because of the pandemic and because of the ridiculous government shutdowns, but we're not going to get the kind of work product out of these people. Turns out they've done a study. They studied 60,000 Microsoft employees in the first half of 2020, and they found that remote work actually triggered a 10% boost in weekly hours because they didn't have to do the commute. And not only that, another study shows about a 13 percentage point boost in productivity for home workers. So all the naysayers to the contrary, apparently homework does work well. But I've put it to you. You can answer any way you like. Do remote workers work even harder than those back in the office? I'd say yes. You can answer any way you like. Glad to have you vote on that at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and at larslarson.com. Now, I've been talking about the song Try That in a Small Town by Jason Aldean, now the subject of a lot of politically correct controversy and cancellation threats and everything else. Country Music Television, CMT, has already pulled the video of Jason Aldean's song, and I said, I think that's ridiculous and it's politically correct. But Sean is a naysayer. Sean, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
So I have to say that I believe what you were making the comparison of Ice-T to Jason Aldean's song, and you just proved my point, is the naysay that here we are 30 years later talking about lyrics. That's our First Amendment right, and it's still relevant. They tried to cancel him for a comment lyrics made of a man who is radicalized, but oppressed, frankly, through cops. And
hold on, Ice-T was oppressed? I would love to have the bank account of that oppressed American.
Well, at that time, I didn't say he was. I was saying he was actually speaking from the point of view of a radically oppressed black man, disparaged youth. Now,
and what the heck did he know about being, I mean, really, Ice-T, celebrity, very, very wealthy, very accomplished, talented guy. What did he know about oppression?
Well, and what would Jason Aldean know about getting his guns?
Life in a small town? I think he knows. Look, I've lived in a small town before. Most of us have.
So have I.
So, okay.
So have I. From Andrews, Oregon.
The only reason I brought up Ice-T's lyrics is that Rolling Stone magazine came out this last week and condemned the Jason Aldean song as being racist, as supportive of lynching and all kinds of awful things, and it doesn't support any of that. And yet they defended Ice-T and his lyrics and thought, this guy is great. He's saying, go kill a cop. You know, and in fact, most of the lyrics of that song, I can't even read on the radio because the FCC would have my hide.
But again, it is freedom of speech, and I agree with you.
No, hold on. Don't throw freedom of speech, and let me tell you why, Sean. Freedom of speech under the First Amendment says the government can't take away my right to say something. I can take away your right. I can say, Sean, the phone call is over. See you. I'm not going to do that. But the First Amendment does not protect your right to speak on this show, nor does it take anything away. First Amendment rights have to do with a limit on the government, not a limit on anyone else. But should
right. So
cancel culture? What's that?
What is the FCC? What is the FCC?
Well, I've always said, Jason, my producers would tell you this. When the FCC says I can't say the F word or the S word or the C word or any of the other dirty words, I'm not going to say them anyway because I think it's crude and it's rude and it's unnecessary. But if somebody ever took the FCC to court and said, can the government say you can't use this word on the radio, I think they'd fail. Except that the FCC's had that rule in place because most of the responsible broadcasters would never say those words on the air anyway. So we don't object to the rule because it's like a rule saying don't stop breathing. Well, don't worry, I won't.
Well, Roger that. More so, think about COVID and RFK Jr. His limit to the freedom of speech has been shut off by multiple sources of
Except when he wants to put his, and I've been censored too by social media, not maybe as much as RFK Jr., but he doesn't have a First Amendment right to be on YouTube. He does have a First Amendment right not to have the government interfere with his speech. And there are Section 230 makes some interesting comparisons, or there's a collision between government granting special rights to certain social media. But when Jason Aldean does a song, and his song says, if you're going to come to a small town intending to, carjack somebody, slap a lady across the face, do things that are, those are criminal acts. Agreed?
Right.
Okay. So if you do that, don't try it in a small town because you're going to find out you don't get away with it in a small town.
I agree fully. My point was if you just watch, let's just say, I'd hate to bring this up, but YouTube, Ice-T's interview, when asked about the song Cop Killer by body count, he said specifically songs about the Second Amendment. Who do you think is going to come and take your guns? And my point being with this is Jason Aldean.
The government.
Who is going to come and take the guns? It's policies of the politicians. So it's going to be cops who are going to be knocking at all of our doors, whether you're in the urban, city, it don't matter. It's going to be cops at the end of the day. The sheriff's the one that we vote in. That's the guy who says, or gal, who says, I'm not going to come and do that. The cops are unfortunately hired through a resume system through the mayors, and they're wonderful. I have no problem with them, by the way.
Then why would do you think
it's
okay though for Ice-T to talk about killing cops and to popularize the idea of killing cops?
Do I personally know on a generalization? Now, if there's bad ones that put me in their crosshairs and want to take my guns and take my rights and constitutional amendments, then we've got problems. Then no problems. Start dropping bodies and start burying them. That's how
it's funny because Ice-T is talking to a group of people. If they behave in thuggish ways and they attack people and assault people, they're probably not legally allowed to possess a gun in any case. So
now we're getting into the Islam and Mujahideen.
But is there anything? But is there anything wrong with Aldean saying, don't do this in a small town? Because I got to tell you, Sean, over the last 3 years, I've seen a lot of small towns which have stood up and just simply showed up when Antifa or BLM says, we're going to show up and we're going to do things in your town. They just show up in numbers, and Antifa shows up, takes a look at the crowd and says, let's go. We're leaving.
I agree with you. I agree with you 100% with that. As a listener, a longtime listener with you, civil disobedience is a thing that you can do without being completely just unlawful and just an arse. So no, I'm
absolutely
about 100%. He has his right to say it, absolutely, and it's factually true. Ice-T, listen again. You're kind of getting into that George Floyd.
I only brought, but understand, Sean. I only brought up Ice-T because when Rolling Stone magazine, which likes to report we're the Bible of music, popular music in America, and they'll defend Ice-T saying, I'm about to dust some cops off. Cop killer,
100%.
Better you than me. Cop killer, blank police brutality. That when he says that, and Rolling Stone loves it, but Jason Aldean says, hey, don't come and attack people in a small town because you won't get away with it, that they hate Jason Aldean for that, and they love Ice-T for saying what he said? Sean, thanks very much. Back in just a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.